Ramiz Mehdiyev, The Reality of the Genocide of Azerbaijan People, Baku 2000. Edited by Fatma Abdullahzadeh. Scientific Truth about the January 20th Massacre. Preface to The Reality of the Genocide of Azerbaijan People by Ramiz Mehdiyev. Until now, there has been a lot of articles, books and photo materials about the 20th January Massacre. I too wrote and made various reports about the horrible crime. Nonetheless, time goes by. 10 years have already passed since that event. This blatant crime committed in Baku and provinces of Azerbaijan on January 20, 1990, according to instructions of the butcher of Azerbaijan people, Mikhail Gorbachev, will be stamped in my memory forever. On January 20, 1990, the Soviet regime perpetrated premeditated carnage against the Azerbaijan nation. It was an unprecedented event. The state used arms against its own citizens, unarmed civilians, including children, women and old people. The population stood up against secession of the part of the motherland. Nagorno-Karabakh was brutally punished. The capital of Azerbaijan and other regions were covered with blood. A few days before the perpetration of this horrible crime, a special propaganda machine of the State Security Committee was put into action and urgent special measures were taken. Hospitals were evacuated, families of Russian officers living in Azerbaijan were evacuated. Russian population of Azerbaijan left the country. Artificial Russian refugees problem was created. Authorities through mass media deceived the population that no troops would enter Baku. A few hours before the carnage, the power-generating block of the Azerbaijan state television was blown up by the Russian militaries. Communications net inside and outside the republic was shut down. And suddenly, on the night of January 20th, different kinds of Russian troops entered the capital under the direct command of the force ministers Yazov, Bakatin and Khrushchev in accordance with Gorbachev's instructions. The crime committed by communistic dictatorship against Azerbaijan in 1990 was similar to those perpetrated against Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Afghanistan in 1979. However, in Azerbaijan that crime differs from the others. The difference is that professional punitive squads detached to Azerbaijan, including Armenian soldiers mobilized in Stavropol, Krasnodar, Rostov, and other provinces of Russia, as well as Armenians served in Soviet military units in Azerbaijan, and even Armenian cadets. Those Russian imperials' rich historical experience of creation of national conflicts and carnage were taken into consideration again during the perpetration of the 20th January blood massacre. Soviet occupation troops also implemented some tactical innovations during the Baku carnage. In all directions of attacks, accompanied by armored troops, power supply was shut down. Confused population was fired upon under the floodlight of the armed vehicles. Masked detachments turned into brutal militaries and machine-gun children, women and old people, physicians, ambulances, civilians overlooking from the windows and balconies, and even hospitals. Injured were shot to death to cover up traces of the grave crime. The massacre was continued till the morning. On the next day, a state of emergency was declared. By the time when the decree was announced through a military radio station, the punitive squad had already completed their body mission and were hastily withdrawn from Baku, and thereafter new regular troops entered the capital. The population was prohibited to go into the streets so as to cover traces of the crime. Artificial skirmish was feigned to prove armed resistance against Russian troops. Stunned, shocked civilians who went into streets to look for perished, injured, and missing relatives were shut down. Unfortunately, some questions concerned with the strange socio-political roots of the event haven't been completely revealed up to date. What's more, the world society wasn't truthfully informed about the 20th January massacre. It was misinformed. The cause of the event and their causes were destroyed. A well-known Azerbaijan scientist is Dr. Ramiz Mehdiyev's book, The Reality of the Genocide of Azerbaijan People, is of great significance for faithful elucidation of the 20th January massacre. Undoubtedly, his work is invaluable contribution of the historiography of the 20th January tragedy. Distinguishing feature of the book is the fact that for the first time the author describes the event on the basis of deep historical scientific research as well as in the context of the world history. He investigates historical roots of the tragedy, draws important generalizations, step-by-step investigates the historical path led to the carnage as well as post-carnage events and processes. In my opinion, the most important distinction of the book to be submitted to the large sections of the world public is objectivity. He manages to keep away emotions and describe historical roots of the tragedy with composure and from the position of the consciousness scientist. Ramiz Mehdiev follows to the motto, "Let everywhere in the world people know the truth about the 20th January event as it is and has been realized that goal with dignity." We should credit him from bringing up the questions why the Baku carnage was so large-scale and blatant in contrast to those committed in Tbilisi in 1989 and Vilnius 1991. Why did the perpetrator of these crimes, Gorbachev, apologize to Georgian and Lithuanian nations but didn't do that in regard to the Azerbaijan people? The author connects these with the three main factors: religious, Islamic factor, Caucasian, and Turkic. It should be noted that Ramiz Mehdiev appealed to numerous sources, important documents, and literature. Real historical processes have demonstrated that Ramiz Mehdiev isn't mistaken in his research. History of tourism blood colonial winnings testifies that expanding from Europe towards the east, the Russian colonialists in the 16th century occupied the Volga Basin, Turkey, Connaught, Kazan, 1552, and Astrakhan, 1556, and enlarged their conquests in two directions, to the east and south. Turkic Altai nations to the monotheistic Siberian forests were subjugated with comparative ease. Thus, shortly after this, the Russians reached the Pacific Ocean coast. Hundreds of peoples, ethnic groups, and cultures were uprooted. Orthodoxization and Russification policy reached great success in the shortest term. However, the Islamic Turkic unity put serious obstacles in the way of the Russian conquerors. Russia's policy of gaining outlet to warm seas by occupying the Caucasus and Iran remained unresolved. Thus, the bloody war of the Russian Empire against the Islamic Turkic peoples were launched. The Tsarist colonialists took the most inexorable position toward Azerbaijan. They developed ideas to remove Azerbaijani Turks from the South Caucasus ethnic political map and Christianize the whole territory. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russian conquerors started lingering wars with Iran and Turkey and launched carnage of the Azerbaijan people on the one hand and mass settlement of Armenians from Iran and Ottoman period Azerbaijan on the other hand. As a result of such policy, the demographic situation of the Azerbaijan provinces Yerevan, Nakhchivan, Connaught changed and the whole territory were Christianized at the expense of settled Armenians. Soon after the division of Azerbaijan between Russia and Iran in 1813 and 1828, Armenian province was created on the western Azerbaijan territories. Thus, the ground of the modern Armenian state in the South Caucasus was established. Russia succeeded in separation of Azerbaijan from Turkey and turning Armenians into political tool in her anti-Turkish struggle. Russia succeeded in separation of Azerbaijan from Turkey, turning Armenians into political tool in her anti-Turkish struggle. Besides, Russia created hearts of ethnic conflicts and confrontations in the South Caucasus. This was beginning of Russia's policy to liquidate Azerbaijan nation adjacent to two Islamic states, Iran and Turkey, and to Christianize the whole territory. The Karabakh together with the Yerevan, Nakhchivan Khanate was undergone the Christianization, Armenianization policy. The Tsarism carried out the bloodiest and dirtiest variant of the divided imperial policy in the South Caucasus. Armenian bandits armed and supported by Russia on the one hand and Russian conquerors on the other hand, and annihilated Azerbaijanians, including Anadolu Turks, under the pretext of struggle against pan-Islamism and pan-Turkism. With great success, imperial butchers were always making use of Armenia's dream to create Great Armenian State. Alliances between Russia pro-imperial and chauvinist circles and Armenian nationalists dreaming about Great Armenia was always at the heart of the perpetrating of genocide against Azerbaijan since Russia stepped into the South Caucasus, including 1905, 1907 carnage, 1918 match tragedy and bloody repression of the Soviet period, 20th January tragedy, Hodjola massacre, and even still remained unsettled Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. I think Ramiz Mehdiyev succeeded in demonstrating the naked truth of the bloody policy on the both historical and modern background, as well as on the basis of concrete facts and strict scientific conclusions. Thus, for the first time, history of the 20th January carnage, its socio-political roots, events and processes caused the 20th January tragedy have been objectively elucidated from the scientific point of view in Ramiz Mehdiyev's book, The Reality of the Genocide of Azerbaijan People. There is a number of other aspects of the January 20th crime. Azerbaijan leadership's traitorous position at the time, Kremlin's open support and protection of Armenian separatists of Nagorno-Karabakh, information war against the Azerbaijan people, pro-Russian stand of the Western states, and U.S. stimulation of Armenian diasporas and chauvinist activity, and other details were skillfully uncovered in this work. The most valuable and encouraging conclusion of the book is the objectively and professionally informed word society about Azerbaijan truth and to create unbiased and faithful public opinion regarding processes taking place in the public, using wide opportunities to mass media, state bodies, and public organizations. It's important in order to prevent a recurrence of the Black January. Thereby, Dr. Ramiz Mehdiyev's work, The Reality of the Genocide of Azerbaijan People, might be considered as his well-founded charge against initiators of the bloody crime committed against Azerbaijan people and, in author's words, purse against the whole humanity. Charges of the International Court of Justice are awaiting them like the norming process. Yago Mikhailov Mahmudov, Honored Worker of Science of the Azerbaijan Republic, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor. Introduction. Not power on earth arouses our indignation at the deepest frame of our moral feelings so as cruelty does. We can forgive any other crime but cruelty. Arthur Schopenhauer. On January 20, 1990, a criminal military action was perpetrated against other people. Soviet military units entered Baku and other regions of the Republic to punish peaceful civilians who took the street as a token of protest against attempts to violate the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, against unfair and biased policy passed by the USSR leadership toward other people. The Soviets were aided by the traitorous policy of the local leaders. As a result, the punitive measures taken with incredibly cruelty, 137 people were murdered and 612 injured. Within the past 10 years, inside and outside of the Republic of Azerbaijan, a great deal of books, articles, and analytical researches was published, where the authors tried to describe events of January 1990 in order to uncover the real reasons of this barbarian action, clear up the role of persons involved in this bloody event in the center and in Republic. Nevertheless, the more we chronologically move away from January 1990 and more actual materials about this event are being assembled, the more questions appear and it becomes more necessary to return back to them in order to disclose the source of this carnage and learn lessons for future generations. The bloody tragedy. The illegal deployment of Soviet troops in the capital and some regions of the Republic of Azerbaijan on January 20, 1990, exportation of peaceful people became an extremely bloody act perpetrated by a totalitarian regime which was an outrage against humanity. Investigation of the similar crimes, revelation of their reasons, outcomes, promulgation of their initiators' names having a statute of limitations, and all these actions ought to be a caution against the recurrence of vandalism and genocide. It's well known that in virtue of the decision of the International Tribunal, Nuremberg 1945 and 46 being famous in the history's Nuremberg trial, supreme statesmen and the military of Germany were accused of the organization and realization of a plot against the world and humanity, exportation of the civilians and maltreatment, plunder of our ship and public domain, etc. That's why Nazi criminals of all ranks are still revealed and prosecuted by state bodies in public movements throughout the world. The Nuremberg process is the first international court which recognized genocide as a very grave felony. Actions of the leadership of USSR and Azerbaijan and the Soviet military contingent which invaded Azerbaijan in January 1990 have all signs deplored by the Nuremberg process. That's why all the culprits of the January 20 tragedy must pay for their deeds. The aggression of the Soviet military unit against Azerbaijan and massive inhuman shooting of civilians became not only a symptom of the collapse of the final routine Soviet regime, but also evidence of the implementation of the old purposeful policy left by Tsarism of expulsion of Azeris from their historical residences. It was a policy which was thoroughly concealed by the USSR leadership under the guise of internationalism. The public situation in Azerbaijan requirements of the people didn't serve as a pretext for such cruelty and vandalism. The people required stopping of slaughter and forcible expulsion of Azeris from Armenia, where they lived from time immemorial, and not like subordination of the Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia. Moscow reacted to this faithful requirement with an incredibly perfidy and frenzy. It should be noted that by the beginning of the 1990s, the Soviet regime fully dissipated its life potential, though Gorbachev and his team were intensively seeking means to extend the regime. The policy of perestroika, which too quickly failed, became a blatant display of these endeavors. Those who told that Gorbachev was deliberately destroying the USSR with the support of the West are mistaken. These talks are nothing but gossip. So-called reformists that a task to preserve USSR within its previous borders, attaching to the Soviet social, political and economic system more attractive features for the West. They had to vitalize the system, removing its odious principles and administration forms. In other words, waste socialism with a human face. Coming from this main postulate, one can assert that the January 20th tragedy has many reasons and it has deep sources. Perestroika only accelerated their development and brought nearer the final of inevitable tragedy. Thus, what are these reasons in general outline? First, the center's aspiration to keep the Soviet Empire and communist system at any price. Second, the consolidation of power in puppet regimes in the national republics. Third, the biased policy of the Soviet leadership with regard to other people in effort to rehash the boundaries under the cover demagogic slogans of perestroika and in particular to violate territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. Fourth, Armenian separatism and aggression based on moral, political and financial and military economic support of the former center. Fifth, traitorous activity of the Azerbaijani leadership. Sixth, the dilettantism and intrigue of those who took control of the rising people, displaying irresponsibility. But one shouldn't limit oneself to the list of the above stated sources, which are basically Soviet, and factors led to the January tragedy. We reiterate that it has much deeper historical roots. Black January is just a link, hopefully the last one of the chain of criminal actions which were perpetrated against Azeri people since the beginning of the 19th century. The biased and just attitude to Azerbaijan is based on far-going geopolitical plans implemented by the Soviet leadership for many years under the ideological cover of the establishment of the international fraternity. While considering events in Almaty 1986, Tbilisi 1989, Vilnius 1991, the following questions arise. Why weren't these actions so bloody and massive? Why did Gorbachev regret and apologize to the Georgian and Lithuanian peoples for events in Tbilisi and Vilnius, but didn't do so in connection with affairs in Azerbaijan? In our opinion, there were three decisive factors in January tragedy. From historical and logical point of view, they are more substantiated than references to the desires of the center to teach and punish obstinate authorities. The religious factor. First, as a religious factor, though USSR leadership tried to justify themselves, they failed to deceive the world community. It's the confession of Islam by others which is one of the main reasons of Gorbachev's support as Armenians and their territorial claims. Numerous publications of the Russian press could confirm our point of view. The notorious Daribalayan used to talk in his interviews and publications about it. Gorbachev appeared on the eve of Baku carnage with provocative statements about the efforts of establishment of Islamic State in Azerbaijan. The use of these religious factors for provocative and destructive purposes was always a tool of the Soviet system and communist ideology. While occupying the leading party post for a long time, he became a witness of the intention of the CPSU Central Committee to impose upon us an opinion as if Islamic fundamentalism was exported to Azerbaijan from neighboring Iran, and that's why the leadership of the Republic was accused of inaction. High-ranking functionaries from the CPSU Central Committee used to expound the case so that Iran exerted an active influence upon the socio-political life of Azerbaijan, where Islam forced out communist principles from the life and consciousness of the population. Of course, Moscow couldn't endure the Muslim danger. Nevertheless, today it steadily tries to become close friends to fundamentalist Iran. In spite of the real state of affairs and found political accusations against our republic were expressed in resolutions of the Secretariat and Political Bureau of the CPSU Central Committee and all union conferences. Some leaders of the republic were labeled nationalists. The Central Committee gave shelter to and took care of obedient people and disgraced the suspects. Actually, the crux of the problem wasn't the imaginary penetration of the Islamic fundamentalism into Azerbaijan. The problem was the struggle of the Christian religion with Islam, what was traditional for Russia and all mistrust to Muslims and non-Russians. It's not accidental that in the USSR, as it was under the Tsarist regime, great power chauvinism brought up on the ground of orthodoxy and opposing of different religions used to be glorified. Authorities were cultivating it instead of fighting it. The whole national policy was based on discrimination of the population confessed Islam and was to retard social, economic and cultural development of the republics populated with ethnic Muslims and not to allow their representatives to supreme authorities. Even if any Muslim was advanced to the prestige post in the central ministers or department, it was not a rule, it was just exception. In short, religious belonging of Azeris determined Moscow's position to the national movement in Azerbaijan and caused an unprecedented authority of its oppression. The national factor. The heart of the first factor caused the tragedy consisted in an affair of Turks. As policy made of mode of thinking of the leaders of the Soviet state. It has deep historical roots and connected first of all with centuries-old confrontation of two empires, Ottoman and Russia. The Soviet regime in its turn was always afraid of the ethnic closeness between Azeris and Turks. That's why in the 1920s and 1930s many outstanding figures of Azerbaijan were accused of pan-Turkism and were subjected to repressions. The Soviet did everything to tear contacts and ties between two pupils. To this effect, at the end of the 30s, the Latin alphabet was replaced with Cyrillic. The Soviet used a secret ban placed on Azeris making business trips to Turkey. The Turkic bugaboo was always a constituent part of the Soviet ideology and geopolicy, what was promoted by Armenian lobby and pro-Armenian circles in Moscow. to foment suspicions of the SSR leaders' desperate fabrication that authorities shouldn't be trusted in all sincerity they are with Turkey. In the years of so-called prehistoric deprivation and instigators, rebellions broke at the headquarters of the SSR in state Azerbaijan to be the very bridgehead from which Turkey was preparing to strike southern borders of the country. January tragedy of 1990 made clear many ulterior sides of the policy of the US. The Caucasian factor. The second factor is caused by the historical interests of Russia in the region, the Caucasian factor. Catherine the Great continued to pursue expansionist policy of Peter I in order to move forward to south and gain an access to southern seas. She advanced the plan to create in the Caucasus two more Christian states except Orthodox Georgia, politically oriented to Russia. This plan implied the birth of the Armenian state of the territory from the river X till Derbent and creation of the Armenian province in the area Yerevan. In this case, persistent appeal of the Crimean Armenians with a request to create an Armenian state with a capital in Yerevan was taken into account. But after conclusion of the Turkmenchai peace treaty, Russia gave up these intentions and decided to build only an Armenian state on the other territories next to the empire. Since the beginning of the 19th century, the tragic history of other people started. Fundamental scientific research proved that the territory of modern Armenia historically belonged to Azerbaijan. The truth is that Armenians lived here in small groups dispersed by the word alien people and penetrated into this area from the territory of the modern Iran, Iraq, Syria and Turkey. Let's scrutinize this issue. The motherland of the initial Armenian tribes was the Balkan Peninsula. The Armenian researchers themselves wrote about it. Those Armenian scholar Menantian agrees with the opinion of the authoritative historians and held that initial Armenian tribes lived in the Balkan Peninsula as far back as the first half of the second millennium BC. The Asian minority came approximately at the half of the 13th century BC. After long-term wandering, mixing with different tribes, they found themselves on the Armenian plateau at half of the first millennium BC. The great historian Diakonov writes in his famous work The Prehistory of Armenian People, Yerevan 1968, the following. We can draw on one conclusion, namely that initial native speakers of Armenian language came to Armenian plateau as nomadic tribes with personal holdings who didn't experience class society. They became familiar with plateau nature and social conditions of the other class society, but as it turns at the time, didn't speak Armenian. Armenians created their state in the 6th century BC. This state covered with some regions of the Armenian plateau located mainly in the middle stream of Tigris and Euphrates. In 387 AD, Armenia was divided between Iran and Byzantium. In the 14th century AD, Armenians managed to create a dwarf state in the southeast of the Mediterranean Sea, Cilicia, ruled by Rubandis. This state existed just a century. In the 5th century, the Armenian church was moved to Echmiadzin in order to create an Armenian state in the South Caucasus. Since the time the history of the Armenian people was called the Echmiadzin period. When the question is about the Armenian story of the 16th, 20th century, it's expounded at the history of so-called Eastern Armenia, which is the actual history of Nakhchivan, Yerevan, and Zengezur lands. Armenians restored their statehood in 1918 on the ruins of the Tsarist Empire, with the assistance of England in the South Caucasus on the territory of Yerevan Khanate of Azerbaijan was the Armenian Republic. Further, her territory was extended by the strong-willed decision of the Bolshevik Moscow at the expense of Azerbaijan. Lacking national statehood, the Armenian Church assumed a role of uniting of Armenians dispersed all over the world. In other words, it settled to some extended political and state issues. Monophysite persuasion, the denial of human hypostasis of God, to which sticks Armenian Gregorian Church was declared heresy as far back as the Chalcedon Assembly 451 AD. As during the Assembly 506 AD, the Armenian Church was excommunicated from other churches and became autocephalous. Famous political scientist Dmitry Formanov holds that just monasticism promoted the rise and development of the sense of abandonment, declares persons, the very suffering of virtue of which Armenian people oppose themselves almost the whole world. Armenian political figures Surem Bulyan wrote, To see everyone as an enemy, to become an enemy for everyone. It's not the past, it's abyss. For the Russian Empire, such state of Armenians was more than sufficient. There is an accidental that Peter I called out Armenians as useful fellow citizens to settlement in Russia and assured them of patronage and protection as co-religionists, see Sergei Glinka. Description of the resettlement of Azerbaijani Armenians within Russia, 1871 edition. Objective and subjective conditions lacking of their own state, indoctrination of ideas of abandonment and suffering by church pastors in the consciousness of Armenians, forming images of an enemy out of Turks and generally Muslims, etc., were conducive to coinciding the age-old aspirations of Armenian Church to establish a national state with colonial interests of the Russian Empire. The crux of the political deal was the following. Russia assisted resettlement of Armenians from Turkey and Iran to the South Caucasus and then created a state for Armenians at the expense of ousting of local population. Armenians in turn pledged themselves to be loyal ally of Russia in Caucasus, her outpost in the region. Armenians were befallen a long-expected chance to realize an age-old dream to create a state under the protection of great power. The great resettlement of Armenians by Tsarist Russia to Caucasus, particularly to Nakhchivan, Iran, and Karabakh Khanate, where others had been living for ages, started after the conclusion of Gulistan 1813 and Turkmenchai 1828 peace treaty between Russia and Iran. Though these truths can be discovered for many people in the modern Russia and West, but in pre-revolutionary Russia, much was written about it. These processes are described in details in the famous book by Shavrov, The New Threat of the Russian matter in Transcaucasus, the sale of Magan to non-Russians. The Russian ambassador to Paris, Alexander Gorbayatov, was zealous in the resettlement of Armenians to Azerbaijan. The Russian ambassador to Paris, Alexander Gorbayatov, was zealous in the resettlement of Armenians to Azerbaijan. In his report to the Tsarist government, he wrote, Muslims worry that Armenians being resettled for a while will remain in Karabakh forever. Resettlement of tens of thousands of Armenian families to Azerbaijan, basically occupation by the Tsarist government and granting them more wide rights and privileges on the ground of religious community, comparing with the local population, soon led to ousting of others from many regions of the South Caucasus. Afterward, this process became gradual deportation. These processes also affected others living in Georgia. The policy of cleansing of Georgia from others pushed by the Tsarist government continued till 1970. There are numerous facts about it. People had to resort to various tricks to protect their families from repression and forcible deportation. They used to change their surnames and ethnic belonging. At present in Georgia there are many people whose surnames are of Turkic origin: Tatarashvili, Mamedashvili, Aslanashvili, Amrejibi, etc. Policy of the extraction from Georgia was passed in 1990s by the former president of Georgia, Democrat Zviad Gamsakhurdia as well. In the years of the Soviet authorities, deportation of other population from the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic became an official state policy. This policy consisted of two constituent parts. First, eviction of others from historical residences. Second, annexion of the part of Azerbaijani territory to the Armenian SSR. Till May 1920, the territory of the northern Azerbaijan made up more than 114,000 square meters. However, as a result of passing part of its territory to Armenia and Russia, now it amounts to 86,600 square meters. The territory was cut off up to 28,000 square meters, area of the Armenian Republic 29,800 square meters. The process of Armenian expansion, accompanied by deportation of other population from historical lands, lasted for the space of almost 2 centuries. This process is marked by the policy of genocide on ethnic grounds, massacre, arson, destruction and devastation of localities, national monuments, etc. Only in the 20th century, more than 2 million others experienced genocide policy passed by official circles of Armenia and their patrons. At the end of the 20th century, Gorbachev, together with his surroundings, did everything to satisfy territorial claims of Armenians and continue a policy of narrowing the territory where others lived in order to further oust them. That's why when the Supreme Council of Armenian SSR adopted the Constitutional Act on reunification of Armenian SSR and Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast of Azerbaijan on December 1, 1989, Moscow in no way reacted to it. The geopolitical aspect of January. Considering the source of the 20th January event, it's impossible not to take into account the position of the Western states either. Let mark right away it was not in favor of Azerbaijan. Central press of the USSR played a great negative role in forming the false image of events in Azerbaijan and the West. Soviet press ruled by the CPSUCC conducted upon ideological indoctrination of the public consciousness with part of Armenian church and ideologists of the Dashnakstim party. They introduced separatism of Karabakh Armenians as a forced act of protest against humiliation and discrimination by the Alpasha government during the Soviet period. Missionaries of the Armenian ideology upholders conducted a wide anti-Azerbaijan campaign and the West as well. The fact that just the day after the Sumgait event, February 1988, the Paris TV show the film dedicated to massacre clear staged and realized by special service parties is a witness to the scale of ideological and information war against Azerbaijan. Formation of a negative stereotype of Azerbaijanis by the Soviet and mass media first and Armenians object to prepare the broad public opinion to appropriateness and Nagorno-Karabakh problem as the forerunner of the tragedy of January. Since the first appearance, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, artificially created by USSR in 1987, was accepted by the other nation as an attempt against Azerbaijani's territorial integrity, outrage on other citizens' constitutional rights. All measures taken by the USSR government and the Soviet Union Communist Party Central Committee, including the Bloody Baku event, testify that there was a specific logic of this lunacy. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is a well-elaborated operation. The USSR Council of Ministers and the Soviet Union Communist Party Central Committee's special decision from March 1988 on social growth acceleration of the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region was unique in the history of USSR. It testifies about collusion between the Central and Armenian leadership. In fact, this resolution laid social and economic foundation to tear Nagorno-Karabakh from the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialistic Republic's jurisdiction. The centrist next step towards the Nagorno-Karabakh withdrawal from Azerbaijan's jurisdiction was the USSR Supreme Council Presidium's decree dated January 12, 1989 on establishment of special form of management in the autonomous region. Nagorno-Karabakh administration was entrusted to the Committee of Special Government, chaired by a Walensky representative of the center, actually dismantling Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan. Further, the USSR leadership chose the way of open massacre of the nation dared to appear for the sake of territorial integrity protection and declared disagreement with unfaithful national policy. Invasion into Baku of large contingent of the Soviet Army Special Destination Unit and internal troops of the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs was accompanied with particular brutality and sin atrocity. The Baku slaughter perpetrated in order to break the nation's will in its aspiration to establish the truth and to abase its dignity and demonstrate the power of the Soviet punitive machine was a real military aggression. This is one of the bloodiest acts of terrorism committed by the totalitarian communist regime in the 20th century, horrible crime against other nation, against humanity and humanism. The people who committed this crime haven't been punished yet, but sometime or other guilty persons will answer before the other nation and the history. Certainly, both the former leadership of the Republic as well as Moscow are responsible for the engagement of troops in matter of peaceful population. According to evidences of investigating bodies, the authorities deliberately acted against the nation's will, blind to fulfilling instructions from the center and not realizing what unpredictable results they would cause. Every day, they were passing to Moscow biased information about current situation in the Republic, executing relevant instructions received from the center under strict control of missionaries of the center instead of maintaining the interests of the nation and Republic. Under the critical circumstances for the Republic, its leadership displayed full inability and acted as an obedient puppet in conformity with the screenplay made by the State Security Committee and USSR's head intelligence service. Witnesses testified that activities of those parties was directed to maximal complication of the situation in the Republic, arranging provocations and diversion. For example, starting 15 January programs in Baku, seizure of the party committees, destruction of the engineering structures of the state bodies, dropping out of enterprises or organizations from subordination to state bodies, etc. All these had one purpose: to destabilize the situation and substantiate implementation of establishment of constitutional order in Azerbaijan. Pursuant order of the chairman of the Republican State Security Committee Vakif Hüseyin on October 7, 1987, so-called crisis groups was established consisting of 12 officers from different committee subdivisions under the head of Vladimir Mirzayev, chief of the 5th Department. Officially, the group aimed at arrangement of purposeful work on revealing, preventing and neutralizing initial actions of opponents, preparation of preventing information for different departments and USSR SSC. It's impossible not to perceive the stereotyped character of such a formulation usually used by security services as a code. Investigative evidences of the crisis group prove in fact that activity sphere was far beyond the limits determined by the order. Provocation, explosions, arsons, murders, assault are the imperfect list of actions the group was engaged in. An analysis of investigation returns shows that the first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan Central Committee, Vazirov, implicitly executing all instructions from Moscow, was the first-hand organizer and accomplice of the grave crime perpetrated against his nation. The second secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan Central Committee, Polyanichko, head of the government, Talibov, chief of the State Security Committee, saying were direct accessories of the crime. Mehdiyev, secretary of the party Baku City Committee, is politically responsible for not taking urgent measures to prevent entrance of troops to Baku and not providing population security. Other members of the CPA, Central Committee Bureau, and heads of law enforcement bodies carry moral and political responsibility for such a situation. Researching the main reasons of the January events, some authors try to put most of the blames of the January event on those who managed demonstrations of many thousand people all stood in opposition to the Vazirov regime, but not on implicit organizers and performers of that wild action. Of course, we can't entirely deny their culpability. However, we should take a behavior of the so-called square leaders in another flatness. Their responsibility has quite a different character and motive. The opposition was in borrowed stage, had no clear organizational structure and program on the eve of the January event. Representatives of scientific and educational institutions, ideological institutions, and bodies that people unsophisticated in policy headed the demonstrations. Some of them took part in all national acts of protest, no sincerity, and others in accordance with considerations of the moment. So what kind of role and place took the opposition in perpetration of January events? Since mid-88, the white masses, realizing that other leadership didn't display resolutionness for suppression of encroachment of the Republic's territorial integrity and in fact took part in carrying out of colossal treacherous plans against citizens of the country, and moreover they would not stop at anything to stifle the popular uprising. Under all the situation, the people stood up for protection of the Republic's honor and dignity, themselves against tearing away its territory, against beating and violent eviction to Azerbaijanians living in Armenia. Unfortunately, the national liberation movement couldn't remain too long without common leading kernel. That's why, just at the time before the masses appeared, impostors whose role wasn't indifferent in further events document and materials over the opposition groups and different person activities during the pre-January tragedy as well as at night to the 20th of January testify. On the whole, opposition carries political and moral responsibility for this bloody tragedy. Nevertheless, we should take into account the fact that those groups included instigators, different carpetbaggers, ambitious persons, not realizing sharpness of artificial situation and seriousness of Moscow's intentions, challenged people to go into the streets to put up resistance to Soviet troops. The blood of innocent people on their conscience. After all, they were examples of restless annihilation of peaceful population in other republics to which Moscow was more loyal than to Azerbaijan. Abul Fazaliyev, Issa Gambarov, Etibar Mammadov, Nemat Panakhov, Ramiz Gaziev, and others are responsible politically and morally for 20th January tragedy. Having a desire to be the leaders of the national liberation movement, they had to realize the possible tragic result of sending an armed people against troops, as well as the responsibility for the people's destinies and lives. Unfortunately, the course of the events showed they were not able to forecast further development of the situation. Evaluating degree of responsibility of opposition groups for the January tragedy, we should take into account their goals and programs, level and character or organizational structure, intellectual potential, overall level of political training of peoples embodies in those groups, their world outlook, activity experience at state establishment and life experience on the whole. Alice, populism, political maturity, ambitions, unreasonable self-sufficiency changed into embarrassment led to the fact that people were once again terribly deceived. In the face of the historical reality. So, what's a summary conclusion of 10 years event? First of all, it should be noted that the history of Azerbaijan 19th-20th centuries demand a thorough knowledge of the past, a profound recognition of the cause and effect relationship of clashes into the tragedy, knowledge of laws of public evolution, and periodicity of stages of people's struggle for liberty. Azerbaijan has never seen such a wide-ranging people's movement like one which took place at the end of the 80s on the eve of January tragedy. This was a really massive national movement. Restoration of violated constitutional rights of the people, maintenance of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan made by ideological basis and slogans of the movement. Soon after the January tragedy, when the people lost their hope for faithful settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict as well as their belief in the central power in the face of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, when it was assured that Azerbaijanians' genocide was carried out with Moscow's assistance, namely by Gorbachev and his team, this movement transferred into the national liberation war. The people realized the historical destination. It was the decree of the fate for them to settle the national problems by themselves. January 1990, the birth of SAS testifying about incurable pain covered all sections of the Soviet society. This was a premonition of collapse of the Soviet political and economic system, full failure of rebuilding policy directed to resuscitation of the socialism under new conditions. The January events covered the whole precipice between people and government of Azerbaijan, unmasked treacherous essence of Azerov's, Talibov's, and Husseinov's activities. The kills of Azerov and Talibov in charge of the Republican SSV, Hussein SSC, Husseinov to Moscow, made since the end of the 1989 till the January tragedy with orchestras and troops to Azerbaijan for keeping order and protecting the state institutions and confirmation of the above stated opinion. We should realize that misfortunes in the history of Azeri people were always caused by the political elite's aspiration to arrange society's life and establish an independent state without having clear fixed conception of national priorities. Very often all nations were substitute for false patriotism, subjective reasons and personal ambitions. Graphic demonstration of that are the bloody 1990 January and other dramatic event of the modern history, namely Ganja Rebellion of 1993 that nearly led to civil war in the Republic, coup, the 8th attempt in October 1994 and March 1995, prepared acts of terrorism against the head of the state itself. January 1990 revealed jeopardy of the policy pursued by the radical opposition wing led that time by the People's Front as well as Marv's correct of the opposition's democratic wing which should carry constructive principles. At present it becomes quite clear at that time there was not any unbroken political force able to head a national movement in the public. There was not even any national leader whose government skills, political perspicacity and wisdom could direct the vigor of national movement into the necessary turn and the law to reach goals without victims and bloodshed. Leader Aliyev possesses all these virtues in full measures. People always perceive him as a skilled and reliable leader. Unfortunately, he was under the Union leadership's control and opposed by secret services in Moscow. All his actions were blocked. In addition, Azerov and his runnings together with Maki groups in Azerbaijan went all lengths, including any kind of provocation and insinuation, to bar Leader Aliyev's returning to the Republic. And that way, populism and irresponsibility of self-styled leaders, political experience of persons promoted to historical proscenium by circumstances played an ominous role in the upcoming tragedy. Their inconsequence and flirt with authorities and secret services predetermined tragic fate of the national movement as well as its destiny of the whole. The most ambitious part of their rising opposition, without calculating the force of their influence, were incompetent representatives of the scientific and creative intelligence and political lead from the movement at the key moment. That was the fatal error adversely affecting further political destiny of opposition. Substitution of democratic values with Bolshevistic slogans, a method of struggle, publicity and intrigue, intolerance and recurrences of totalitarian mentality, intellectual poverty and lack of modern ideas matching the time are the moral and political environment of arising of the opposition. That's typical for the irreconcilable opposition of today's political life. Impulse of possessing at any price the power over the people obtained at the beginning of the national movement still defined activity of the radical opposition. Doesn't want to accept that not all methods of struggle formed in the 1980s and the earlier 1980s were justified by real processes taking place in the country today. Confrontational methods are anachronism and they evidence about lack of political foresight and maturity, lack of information about real interests of the people under conditions of creating independent democratic state, and stability has been established when the law, parliament and press are regulating state activity. Speech of Hyder Aliyev at a meeting in the permanent representation of the Azerbaijan Republic in Moscow on January 21, 1990, dedicated to the tragic events of January 20, 1990. Dear comrades, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I was the leader of the party organization of Azerbaijan for many years. I was elected a member of the CPSU Central Committee and acted as the first deputy chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers. At our 2 years since I retired, I had a serious heart attack that caused my retirement. The first time since December 1982, when I left Azerbaijan, that I came to the permanent representation of the Azerbaijan Republic in Moscow, and the tragedy in Azerbaijan made me come here. I learned about it in the morning and couldn't remain indifferent to the event happened in Azerbaijan. First of all, I come here to the representation, that's just a small island of Azerbaijan in Moscow, to express my condolences to the Azerbaijan people in connection with the tragic event entailing horrible consequences, deaths of my compatriots. Secondly, I'd like to express my attitude toward this matter. I'm requesting the permanent representative of Azerbaijan in Moscow, Rahab Ibrahimov, to pass my words of deep sorrow and my sincere condolences to the people of Azerbaijan. Unfortunately, it's all I can do currently. As to the events happening in Azerbaijan, I consider them illegal, hostile to democracy, totally contradicting the principles of humanism and the establishment of the jural society. There are certain reasons why this situation developed in Azerbaijan. I don't like to go into details. I'd like to take too much time. The notorious ethnic conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia has been going on for 2 years already. This conflict has arisen in connection with the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and around it. 2 years is quite a long time for the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia and for the top part and political leaders of the country to settle this matter, stop the internal war, ethnic conflicts, and allow all people, irrespective of their nationality, to live a free life in our common federation of the Soviet Socialist Republics. However, in my opinion, necessary measures in this respect have not been taken. If necessary actions had been initiated at the beginning of the troubles in Nagorno-Karabakh, we would now observe the escalation of the tension and losses on both sides during the past 2 years, and that military assault undertaken over the night from 19 to 20 January 1990, which brought heavy losses. At first of all, the fault of the Foreign Affairs Secretary of the Central Committee of Azerbaijan Communist Party, Abdurrahman Vazirov. Being the leader of the Republic, we made practically nothing to stabilize the situation in Azerbaijan. On the contrary, by his attitude and manner of work and political maneuvers, he opposed himself to people and couldn't inspire trust, creating a gap between himself and people who were indignant. Demands were made at the meetings held for the past few months in Baku and other towns and regions of the Republic for the party leaders of Azerbaijan to resign, especially and primarily concerning Vazirov. It seems strange that this problem hadn't been solved. Only yesterday, after military troops were brought in to see the massacre carried out, Vazirov ran away from Azerbaijan. It has been a serious mistake. The fatal mistake was to appoint this man who was inappropriate for the position of the first secretary of the Central Committee of Azerbaijan Communist Party. I'd like to speak in detail about the tragic event that happened over the night of the 20th of January and is still going on. I think that there was opportunities for the political arrangement of the situation in Azerbaijan. The leaders of Azerbaijan, top political leaders of the country, have not used all reserves. The incident of the border could have been prevented. People expressed their demands in connection with frontal line 3 months ago. Nobody wished to meet them to explain them the situation, to take precautionary measures. I'd like to say again, there still were possibilities to calm people down then. If 2-3 months ago the problem of the party leader in Azerbaijan was settled, it wouldn't have been necessary to bring military troops into the city. I still think that political regulation was possible, but the possibilities were not used, and as a result, regular troops of the Soviet Army and Ministry of Defense were brought to Baku over the night of the 20th of January. Tragic consequences of this action are well known. I regard this decision as a political mistake. They were not aware of the actual situation in the republic, of the peculiarities of the psychology of Azerbaijan people. They were not in contact with different circles of the society and thus couldn't foresee the consequences. Such consequences should have been foreseen and preventive measures should have been taken. By the way, there has been information that among victims there were many soldiers. Why should Russian flaws sent by the wrong decision of the top party leaders have suppressed the so-called revolt in Azerbaijan? Should so many troops have been brought to Azerbaijan? I'm well informed how many troops had been stationed in Azerbaijan. There have been dislocated quite many troops, the Forsam, the Caspian Military Navy, landing forces, air defense troops, troops of the Ministry of Defense. Was there any real need to bring additional troops there? If necessary, the troops already having been existed, there could have been used. The leaders of Azerbaijan who took such a decision in the first place, Vazirov, ran away from Azerbaijan. They should bear responsibility. Those misinforming the country's top political leaders should also bear responsibility. I think that top political leaders of the country didn't have access to the objective information in good time. The country leaders were misled, and as a result such a decision was taken. Everyone involved in the tragedy should be punished.